Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Pittsburgh School of the Arts podcast. I'm Destin LaCornu.
And I'm Kate Griffin, and I'm the owner of Pittsburgh School of the Arts. Destin owns Sunset Place Studios. This is just a great opportunity to sit down and talk about some stuff, so we're excited to be here today.
Yeah, we just wanted to kind of continue along the theme of the previous podcasts where we're just thinking about how do we teach students to the best of our ability? What are some of the psychological factors that go into that? And how can we really be empowering not only our teachers, but the parents of our students to better help them as we work with them in private lessons? And so we've been talking a lot about mindset. The very first podcast, we talked about growth mindset, which is just the concept that like most of us have this default thinking about what we can and can't do like it's set in stone. Instead of looking at life as a journey where you never really stop learning what you're capable of. And then the last podcast, we kind of talked about that, you know, you're always going to have natural limitations, but there's so much room for you to grow into your strengths that your limitations actually aren't that big of a deal. That's just what makes us all different.
And I think it's a good reminder, like, that we're applying this information not just to ourselves as individuals and teachers and leaders, but also, like you said, we're hoping that our audience is going to encourage teachers, coaches, parents, even students as they listen, and so that all of us can kind of take some of these music-focused lessons, but also apply them to other aspects of our lives. So we're all about that, having a growth mindset just in life.
Yeah, exactly. So today what we thought we'd talk about is like, is mindset enough for effective learning, which it really isn't enough. There's obviously hard work that factors into that. And so we want to make sure that that we're all working smart and not just working hard with poor learning methods. And so I just kind of wanted to start by talking about like how do we actually learn? Specifically, how do we teach people how to learn?
Yeah, and before you get into the background of that, just give a little bit from yourself, because I know you come from like a unique psychology background. So speak to just your personal kind of story and then how it plays into laying a foundation for today.
Yeah, so I'm a psychology major, even though music is my full-time job. I just always kind of thought if I was going to spend the time studying anything in college, I might as well figure out how people work. And so I ended up doing some graduate level work, and I worked as a research assistant in a lab. And so it's something that's always fascinated me as just a person who's interacting with a lot of people on a regular basis, whether it's students or my clients in the studio. I see part of my job as not just, you know, teaching them music or helping them make music, but really encouraging them and trying to get to the root of some of the things that stop a lot of people from achieving their dreams, because I've been through that myself. I'm constantly analyzing, you know, what could I be doing better? What's just like a mindset kind of thing that might be causing me to stand in my own way? And
there's a lot more to that when it comes to music, when it comes to psychology and people's fears and being vulnerable and all that stuff that kind of plays into it. So
For sure.
It lays a really good foundation that I love that that's part of your perspective.
Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about learning over the course of childhood, since most of our students are in some stage of childhood. So learning is something that we're like biologically predisposed to doing. We practically come out of the womb wanting to explore the world, and we have these parts of our brain that are optimized for learning to talk, learning to walk. And what's interesting is that children are actually doing a form of science before they even know what science is. They're running little experiments. They're knocking objects off of tables and figuring out that gravity is a thing. They're predicting how their parents are going to behave so that they can get away with things. And then what happens is that when children enter school, they've got to start relearning some of this folk science. And replacing it with things that they would never be able to learn outside of adults telling them. But the problem with this is it's really unnatural to learn just from secondhand knowledge. You actually have to be taught how to learn from a teacher or how to learn from a book. and internalize something that you haven't personally seen or touched or experienced yourself. And so this is something that causes some students to have some real challenges with learning, especially if they don't quite learn in the same way that everyone else does, or maybe they have some attentional issues. And so this is something that I've observed a lot with my own students, because I've taught enough students now to where I see where, maybe 80% of students are able to grasp this concept if I teach it in a certain way, but then there's this 20% that just don't connect with it. And so I really wanted to think through, like, how do we bridge this gap between kind of the primary learning that all of us do just on our own, just through observation, versus learning something really foreign. And one of the things that occurred to me is, like, as you get older, we almost kind of forget how to learn things that are completely outside of our experience. We forget how difficult it was to learn to read or write, because most of that happened before we were old enough to remember it. And then as we get older, it's like a lot of our learning is just building on knowledge that we already have. But then if you learn how to, like, play a new instrument or learn a foreign language, you're going back to that square one of completely foreign to you. And that's really where a lot of our students are at. They're coming to us old enough to kind of have already learned a lot of those basic skills. And young enough that it's still going to be fairly easy for them to pick up something new, but it's not easy.
So there must be some actually neuroscience and truth to the psychology of the fact that it's easier to learn things when you're younger. And kids tend to be a sponge. We do have a good amount of adult students, but I do hear comments from them all the time, like, this isn't as easy for me as it used to be, or I just don't seem to have the memory that I had when I was younger, or it's taking me longer to do things. And so unfortunately, I think that there is science to back that up. The fact that it becomes a little bit more challenging as we get older. Not to say that we shouldn't try new things as we get older, but I think that there is some truth to this as you're about to kind of dive into.
There definitely is, yeah. But the good thing is the learning methods that allow someone to enter a completely new field and slowly make progress are really the same whether you're 8 years old or 80 years old. You might just face a little bit of that extra uphill challenge the older you get, but it doesn't mean that you still can't achieve the same goals. It might just mean you have to take it a little bit slower. But really, there's a couple different modes of learning that educators kind of walk children through without children even realizing they're doing this. The older you get, though, the more you kind of have to do this for yourself. Even if let's say you're 12 years old, and your parents are reminding you to practice on a regular basis, but it's still you who has to remember what your teacher told you and what exactly they want you to have prepared by the next lesson. And so even young children are expected to take some level of responsibility in their practice. And so a thought that I kind of had was like, and this is just kind of relating to my own experience of taking lessons when I was younger, because I took fairly naturally to drums and guitar, but my parents wanted me to take piano lessons, and I was not excited about that. I had no interest in piano, and I really didn't enjoy it. It wasn't something that I had the natural curiosity to kind of fuel me like many students do. I would have rathered to be playing drums or guitar. So for a long time after that, I didn't even touch a piano. Until I was in a situation at my church where we had like multiple drummers, multiple guitar players, and no one to play keyboards. So there was like a good 2 or 3 year period where that was mostly what I did every single week. And what was interesting is a lot of that knowledge that I had absorbed when my teacher probably thought I wasn't paying attention, I actually remembered, and I was like, oh, okay. Now I get it. And I started to kind of merge that knowledge with this practical application of just learning what I needed to do. I didn't have to play complex classical pieces at church. I just needed to know how to play certain chords, certain inversions. So I began to apply that knowledge. So this kind of leads me to talk about two different ways that the brain works, which is spotlight thinking and lantern thinking.
And before we get into that, then, did it become more enjoyable for you in that moment when you were, having to take that practical knowledge and to take what you had learned in piano lessons, which wasn't so fun, and apply it? Kind of talk about how that came together for you, because I kind of had a similar experience. I grew up, taking piano lessons, but there was a moment when I was around 12 years old also, where my practicing had been very methodical, very structured, very routine, very discipline-oriented kind of thing, which, I did enjoy. But there was an aha moment that happened to me, which kind of, I think, leads us into this lantern versus spotlight thinking concept. And that is when a leader from church showed me the chord method versus practicing scales, classical note reading. And it kind of opened up this realm of creativity that I didn't really know existed or was able to apply from a musical standpoint. At that point, it had all just been, read the notes on the staff, follow the rules, here's the formula, learn these scales, do this, do that, check it off the list. But all of a sudden, when I had freedom to say, here's a key signature, play these 3 chords, do whatever you want, use whatever inversion you want, experiment, and the sky's the limit, and make melodies. And I went into this kind of creative realm. Wow, that was an aha moment for me as well. So talk a little bit about what you mean by this lantern versus spotlight thinking, because I think this is such a beautiful thing if we can get to a student to come to this place where those two kind of collide together, and you're able to combine the two.
Yeah, so private lessons and really any kind of instruction is biased towards spotlight thinking, and it's just inherently so because of practicality. And so spotlight thinking is linear thinking, rational thinking. It's sort of this follows that. And for your brain to do this, it kind of has to have a pre-established network of thought patterns that you've learned. You've been taught how to solve a particular type of problem, and then you're going to be faced with a lot of those problems, and you're just going to go back through the series of steps. It's basically like mathematics, which most math taught in school is not actually pure mathematics. It's just a sort of form of applied problem solving where you've learned a series of steps. And I mean, this is extremely useful, but it's not the only way that our brain solves problems. It's just, it's convenient for testing it, for measuring a student's progress. So this is how we often teach in private lessons. We'll assign, a new task each week, and we'll show the student exactly how to do it so that they're very clear on what to do. And we hope that they come back next week having gone through those series of steps and mastered it. And that's important to do. But there's another way that our brain operates, which has been termed lantern thinking. So if you picture a spotlight illuminating just one little narrow thing at a time, a lantern illuminates everything in the room, including things that have absolutely no relation to each other. It's not putting the emphasis on one object. It's showing you everything that can coexist. So what happens when you sleep or when you relax or you're doing something that's unrelated to this subject is your brain forms new connections. Your brain is constantly synthesizing these new connections between things that have nothing to do with each other, and this is really the impetus for creativity. Creative people just kind of naturally do this better than most people, but everyone does this to an extent. So really the takeaway, to kind of tie all this together, is you have to do both to excel at anything and to enjoy anything. There's a huge benefit to the structured practice time. I tell my students, even if you just spend 10 minutes a day just doing this very routine, very kind of by the book thing, it's going to help. Just get that out of the way. But then you also have to allow yourself to just freely explore. And this is actually getting back to what I had started today's podcast talking about, which is learning through your own experience, learning through kind of unstructured exploration the world, and that's sort of the natural way that we learn. But what's going to happen is it's the same exact experience when you're stuck on a problem and you go to bed and you wake up the next day and all of a sudden you have this solution. You're like, how did I not think of that? And it's because your brain has literally formed a new synapse while you were sleeping.
So is it even possible, though, to get to that creative place where you're able to, put information together in our terms, like explore the creativity of music without first having the spotlight approach? Because I know that the majority of people that sign up for lessons or parents that sign their kids up for lessons, most of them want to have some kind of strong foundation, a classical exposure, lay the groundwork, and there has to be some knowledge there, some knowledge
Right.
base to build off of. And so I found, at least from my own experience as a teacher, that the goal is obviously to get to the place where we're able to do both, where we're able to have spotlight thinking and lantern thinking coming together, where we're using our knowledge base and the discipline and the skills that we've learned, and had some input throughout the years, come together with the creativity and with the different passions and genres and types of music and everything that's potential there, and have them both work together. But I have found, and I've heard myself say this to students over and over again, is, give a little bit of time to work up to that place, because the type of music that you want to play, or the kind of songwriting that you want to be able to do, or the way that you want to be able to play like this person that you see at a concert or that you see or hear on YouTube, can only happen if you have laid some groundwork. And so the goal for me sometimes is I feel like I've got to start with the spotlight approach, and then at some point along the way, a student is finally ready then to kind of step into that creative mode and be able to take what they've learned and then, take it where they want to go.
Yeah.
But have you experienced the same thing for yourself, or would you say that you don't always have to start with the spotlight approach?
Yeah, well, I think starting with that foundational stuff sure makes it easier for you. I mean, it is possible to become a great musician without any formal training. There are plenty of examples of this. Most people are probably not going to succeed at doing that. And even those who do are probably going to wish at some point later in their life that they had spent more time learning some of those basics, because all it can do is just shortcut you to the things you really want to be doing. It's kind of like if you're cooking. Usually the first thing you do is you go to the store, get all your ingredients, and you've got them all laid out on the table. You can cook if you're, running back and forth between the store, buying stuff you don't have, but it's going to be a total pain. And so, I sort of had the opposite experience with guitar, where I basically taught myself to play guitar. Even though my dad was a guitar player, I kind of had this thing where I didn't want to play the same instrument as my dad at first. And so he would try to show me stuff. I wasn't all that interested. But at some point, almost in secret, I started messing around with it. Just using my own totally bizarre approach. I really didn't learn there really is no proper method, but I didn't learn the things that could have saved me a lot of time and struggle until later. And then I was like,
you were interested to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I really think it certainly can't hurt to have that foundation. It can never hurt you. And it kind of leads me to another point that I think we would both love to communicate to our parents especially, which is that learning is never a waste of time. Lessons are never a waste of time. I've had some parents come to me and they feel almost a little bit embarrassed that their child is not taking it seriously, and they think maybe they're wasting my time, and no student can ever waste my time, because I know as long as they're in an environment where they're seeing music happen, they're going to remember that, because kids remember a lot, way more than I think most of us adults believe they do. And you never know when that memory is then going to come back to them, and now they're interested. Now they actually have internalized that maturity and that desire to start learning on their own. And you never know when that switch is going to click for them. Sometimes it's well into adulthood. And so it sometimes takes years and years of a student not enjoying lessons, like I did with piano, for it to finally pay off.
Yeah, and I feel the same way too. As I have kids in lessons, and they practice what they want to practice, like, in the week making songs up and messing around, but do they actually practice what their teacher has assigned for them? Not all the time, unless I'm kind of leaning over their shoulder and encouraging them and sometimes sitting right there with them. But I feel the same way. I do believe that just the routine of coming every week and making this a part of our life and a part of our schedule, and the input that is coming into them through the environment and through their teacher, and those seeds that are being planted, even at a young age, they will ultimately germinate and take effect, and they are laying a foundation. So I agree with you 100% that there's still a lot of good and benefit that can come out of simply coming to lessons week after week and being in that habit, if nothing else. Of course, it'll be even more effective if they can practice even once or twice outside of a lesson week to week, but there's absolutely benefit to that. And the other thing I want to say is some students come and they really do buck that whole structured environment. They truly just want to create and experiment and be in this lantern thinking posture all the time. And it's very hard sometimes to get those kids to discipline themselves enough to do, some of those foundational things. We continue to try and we continue to encourage and kind of plant seeds in that way. But it is very important, I think, to hook a child's imagination and their passion and their joy for music in order to keep them engaged throughout the long haul, because there's so much vying for our time and sports and school and activities. And the older that the kids get, there's a lot competing, for them. And so I always say, yes, of course, we want to go for a level of excellence and have this level of discipline and commitment for sure. But if you don't connect with the heart of a child and with the kind of music that they love, that they're having fun with, and there's not smiles and some form of joy around it, eventually, again, it's all within reason, because some things that you have to do, even if they're uncomfortable and there's an element of discipline, and you have to push through, and there's seasons that are fun and other seasons that aren't as fun. But over the long haul, you ultimately want to hook the imagination and the heart of that student so that they're loving coming, no matter what that looks like. And I think a good teacher is able to kind of manage that tension, where they're feeding the creative side of a student as well as putting in foundational knowledge and discipline and training, and kind of trying to mix it in a way. And that's why private lessons are so awesome, is because they're very individualized, and you can kind of take every student where they are, at the level that they are, at the speed that they're going to learn, at the amount of work that they're going to invest, and you can work with that student in whatever works best for them, whatever methods they respond well to, and just make it the best experience it can be for that child. And so, I think there's not a perfect formula for how to teach or run lessons. I mean, we have a loose structure, but I think it's really a matter of how do you take a student and engage them both in some way to the best benefit of that child, and what the parents are looking for as well.
Yeah. And so I think I 100% agree. I have a heart for the students who don't want the structure, they don't want the discipline, because that was kind of me as a kid. And so I'll try to be upfront with them and just and explain to them my experience in lessons. I want to be honest with them that, hey, I was that way too. So I get it. You don't want to always do what you're told. So I've come to find a lot of students are willing to make that trade-off of we're going to spend 15 minutes working on scales or rudiments or something that's not fun. Then we're going to spend the next 15 minutes learning a song you want to learn, or just letting you ask me a bunch of questions. I have students that do that. They'll just ask me question after question after question. I love that.
For what interests them.
Yeah.
And I do the same thing too for the older kids. I try to give them, after they get out of the elementary stage where you're literally telling them, what scales to play and what songs to do in the book, and they have to follow a very structured thing because they don't know anything else. Once they get to enough of an independence, whether that's, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, however it is, it does become a kind of trade-off in a conversation with that student, at least for me, where I kind of say, I know this is what you really want to do. I know this is where you want to spend your time and your passion, and this is what you would like to do for the entire lesson. But let's do this part first, and then we'll get to that. And I even say in practicing the same thing, work on putting 5 or 10 minutes through running through your warm-ups or running through this Bach piece, and then allow yourself the rest of the time that you have, however long you feel inspired or can can sit at the piano and play to do the other stuff,
Yep.
and begin to give them practical practice strategies as well of just kind of work before play. You can't just live your life by eating dessert all the time. You have to have some meat and potatoes, and then give yourself rewards creatively as well. So that's tended to work for me too.
Yeah, and those two modes of practicing, they're going to feed into each other. The structured learning is going to benefit the free exploration, and the things you learn in the free exploration, it's going to come back to the structured things that you learn, and that just gets back to the idea that your brain is constantly rewiring itself. Your brain will literally take whatever activity is going on and try to make sense of it and try to connect it all. So the more you're feeding your brain, the more it's going to find commonality between all of that. And that's why learning is just, it's a beautiful thing that you never have to stop doing. It's always going to keep you fresh no matter how old you are. So really, I think to kind of tie all this up and to sort of give the prompt for our next podcast, which is, it's great in concept to freely explore something. But what if you don't really have an outlet for that? What if you don't really know how to just invent something yourself, or you don't have an opportunity to play with other musicians or some of the activities that allow you to kind of stumble on things yourself? What if you don't even know where to start with that? And so there are some ways that you can actually kind of create that for yourself as a student, as well as ways that we as teachers can kind of create that for our students. We can kind of give them problems to solve, so to speak. And so that's, I think, what we're going to touch on a little bit in the next episode.
Sounds good. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. And just an encouragement to the parents out there that are listening, encourage your students, just whatever engages them, whether it's the creative side or the discipline side or a little bit of both. The more that the parents and the grandparents can encourage their child just to play their instrument and to get in front of that thing and to stay inspired in music, to stay interested in what they're working on, to stay interested in what lights them up, to listen to them, to ask them to play something for you, that encouragement is so huge, I think, in the development of every student, and something that we want to see happen. And so we'll talk about more of these outlets and ways that we can encourage kids to perform and use what they're learning the next time.
And I would add one more thing to that, which is not every student is really going to be interested in music. And if that's the case, that's something to recognize. I think if a student shows any kind of aptitude, any kind of small interest in music, that means there's some kind of potential in them that can be explored. But there are some students where they don't like it, they don't want to be there, and I think that's perfectly okay. That was me with sports. I'm thankful my parents never forced me to do sports. And so I would say look for that little spark of enjoyment, of excitement, no matter how kind of much in its infancy it might be. But also don't force it.
Yeah. But there's always benefits that can come from exposing your child to music, even if they don't end up picking that as their path or their thing.
Always, yeah.
They are learning, they are growing. It's part of development and trying new things. And so they will always benefit from the exposure to it. And then it's really fun when you see a student latch onto something or express curiosity or passion in a certain area, and then you can really get behind them and push them forward.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you in the next episode.